Next, we have the duo of Jamie Stone and Helen Xiong. I've been practicing that. They will be talking about doping carbon nanotubes and organic solar cells with strong organic acceptor molecules.
Hi, I'm Jamie Stone.
I'm Helen Xiong.
And our project is doping carbon nanotubes and organic solar cells with strong organic acceptor molecules. The first question you might ask is, why would you want to use an organic solar cell? Solar energy in general is very renewable and sustainable, unlike traditional fossil fuels. Silicon-based solar cells are already on the market today, but organics are more versatile, more flexible, and they can be easily mass-produced using chemical processes, which makes them cheaper. Although organics have extremely low efficiencies, the technology is very new, so there's a lot of room for improvement. Additionally, organics are so much cheaper that you can make, that manufacturers can create in large numbers a bunch of organic solar cells with very low efficiencies to achieve the same cost per watt of power as silicon-based solar cells. In a very basic model of an organic solar cell, a photon of light is absorbed in a layer of semiconducting material, which causes an electron to gain energy as it travels from the HOMO level to the LUMO level, and this creates an exciton pair of a negative electron and a positive hole. This exciton then breaks as the electron relaxes down from the donor to the acceptor and then to the cathode as the hole moves upward from the donor to the anode. To improve the basic solar cell, you can add what's called a hole transport layer. This functions to block electrons while facilitating the movement of holes. This works because the HOMO level is around the same level as the anode, so the hole can still travel upward, but the LUMO level is much higher than that of the donor, so the electron cannot move toward the anode. In our research, we had our main objective was to increase organic solar cell efficiency by doping. We doped both carbon nanotubes and hole transport layers. We doped both multi and single-walled carbon nanotubes so we could increase their conductivity so they could be used as electrodes in solar cells. We did this because carbon nanotubes are both transparent and flexible, much like the solar cells we wanted to create. We also doped hole transport layers. We wanted to replace the doped P.PSS with doped TAAPD. We also wanted to characterize TAAPD in the process. Finally, we wanted to incorporate both the doped carbon nanotubes and the doped hole transport layer into both small molecule and polymeric solar cells. Our objective is doping, but what is doping? Doping introduces charge carriers by adding a very small concentration of materials into specific layers of a device. Dopants are usually small molecules such as F4TCNQ, its chemical structure is pictured, and AOB. Doping is good because it increases conductivity in devices, and it can also be P-type, which removes electrons, creating a strong electron acceptor, or N-type, which adds electrons, creating a strong electron donor. Changing the number of electrons and the energy levels can actually change the placement of energy levels. And if these levels can move closer to the anode, you can facilitate a better ohmic contact. Very basically, in our solar cells, we replace the ITO anode with doped carbon nanotubes, and the doped hole transport layer of P.PSS with doped TAAPD. So we mentioned doping, but how about the dopant? We used tetrafluorotetracyanopiquinodimethane, otherwise known as F4TCNQ. F4TCNQ is a P-type dopant. It's only soluble in a couple of solvents such as THF and chloroform, and it's been known occasionally to P-pod. P-podding means that a molecule of F4TCNQ goes inside carbon nanotubes when you dope them, which is in the picture. The whole transport layers that we used were P.PSS and TAAPD. P-dot is commonly used in both organic solar cells and diodes, but it has several disadvantages. It absorbs oxygen and water from the surrounding atmosphere. It's acidic, so it has a tendency to degrade the devices it's in. And it also causes problems in small molecule devices. And because of these disadvantages, we were hoping to replace P-dot with TAAPD. This polymer is extremely new and was synthesized by Daniel Day of Dr. Smith's group. It had a lot of properties that we didn't know about, so we wanted to characterize it, but we did it did have several advantages. It's insoluble in water, it's thermally stable, and it has a very large band gap, which means that, that light is not easily absorbed into it, or in other words, it's transparent.
So basically our experiment, we started off by finding the best doping conditions for we tested different concentrations. You can see the concentrations up there. And we also tested different pre-annealing temperatures for the nanotubes before they were doped. Our process for making the carbon nanotube anodes was basically, first we put the single-walled and the multi-walled nanotubes on the ITO substrate where the ITO served as the electrical contact. Then we densified them. After that, we pre-treated the carbon nanotubes. Some of them we placed under a UV ozone treatment, and some of them we pre-annealed at different temperatures. After that, we spun coat the F4TCNQ dopant solution in an inert atmosphere. And then after that, we annealed the doped carbon nanotubes from 75 to 200 degrees Celsius in 25-degree intervals, and we took the resistance at each temperature. Finally, for our lifetime studies, we exposed the carbon nanotubes to air and measured their resistance. So here are some of the results for our nanotubes. These were the normalized resistance for our single-wall nanotubes. Normalized resistance is simply the resistance we measured after doping divided by the resistance we found before doping. We discovered a strong doping effect on the single-wall nanotubes. The resistance dropped by a factor of 4. In multi-wall nanotubes, the resistance dropped by up to 1/3, which is still a significant improvement in resistance. We discovered that 200 degrees Celsius is the best pre-annealing temperature for the nanotube before doping, and 125 degrees Celsius the best post-doping annealing temperature. We predict this is the reason why, because annealing, first of all, it helps the F4TCNQ to p-pod and intercalate into the nanotubes, and also because annealing causes impurities such as water and oxygen to evaporate. These are the results of our concentration study. We discovered that obviously, an increased concentration of dopant decreases the resistance by a lot. However, we discovered that the doping effect begins saturating. As you can see, there's a large difference between the light and the medium doping, but not quite as much of a difference between the medium and the heavy doping. We also found similar results in multi-wall nanotubes. However, we discovered that dissolving the F4TCNQ in THF as opposed to chloroform, which is what we did all the other solutions, and actually increase the resistance as opposed to lowering it. Finally, these are the results of our lifetime studies. After we finished doping the nanotubes, we exposed them to air. As you can see, there's very little change between day 3 of exposure to air and day 21 of exposure to air. This showed us that the doping effect is stable, and we also found similar results in the multi-wall nanotubes. Our next step was to incorporate the carbon nanotube anodes into a solar cell device with a doped hole transport layer. As you can see on the slide, this was our process for making those solar cells. We made both actual solar cell devices, and we also made diodes for the space charge limited current measurements, which tells us about the mobility of the device. So what we have here is a solar cell voltage current graph. This is what we use to determine the efficiencies of our solar cells. In a nutshell, what you want to see is this deep curve inside the 4th quadrant. This indicates that a lot of power is being generated. Conversely, on the dark current voltage curve, you want to see an asymmetrical behavior because in the dark, a solar cell is supposed to act like a diode. If the dark curve is symmetrical, it means that the device is shorting or that the charges are bypassing the transport layer, which completely defeats the purpose of solar cell. The graphs you see here are for our control small molecule cell. This has no hole transport layer. As you can see, we see shorting in the devices with nanotube anodes. This is because the nanotubes are sticking out of the transport layer and contacting both the anode and the cathode and creating a short circuit. This is the device with a P3HT hole transport layer. As you can see, the nanotubes are no longer shorting the device. However, because the P3HT adds in about another 150 nanometers of thickness to the solar cell, it increases the resistance, which decreases the amount of power that's generated. Finally, you see our control device with a doped P3HT whole transport layer. As you can see, the nanotube curves are almost identical to the reference curve, and a significant amount of power is being generated, and the efficiency is rather high. However, why do we not use P3HT, and why do we want to test TAPD? This is because we took because P3HT absorbs a lot of light. This is an EQE plot of P3HT. EQE is external quantum efficiency. It's simply the percentage of incoming photons that actually end up generating an exciton pair, which leads to charge generation. But as you can see, the P3HT absorbs the light from 400 to 600 nanometers here, and because of that, it's limiting the amount of current that's being generated. TAPD, on the other hand, is transparent and does not have this disadvantage. However, when we actually incorporated the TAPD into small molecule cells, you can see that the results were not very spectacular. This is the reference cell, the control, and this is the actual doped TAPD layers. Because of this, we predict this is because the TAPD has very low charge mobility and will not work as a whole transport layer for organic solar cell. So, in conclusion, we found that F4TCNQ has a strong doping effect on both single-walled and multi-walled nanotubes. The optimal pre-annealing temperature for the nanotubes is 200 degrees centigrade, and the post-doping annealing temperature is 125 degrees centigrade. We discovered that higher concentrations of dopant led to higher conductivity. However, at a certain concentration, the doping effect becomes saturated.
Prolonged exposure to air does not degrade the doping effect we observed on our devices. TAAPD is not currently a viable replacement for P.PSS, chiefly because of its extremely low mobility. F4TCNQ doping had a strong effect on both carbon nanotubes and whole transport layers. However, further study is needed before a viable whole transport layer can be found.
And then we would like to thank Salerno and UTD for our multi-walled nanotube samples, and Aalto University in Finland for our single-walled nanotube samples, and also Dina, Ian, Ray Bauman, and Dr. Collins for coordinating the NanoExplorers program. Thank you.